Intentional torts. This is an overview. First of all, what is a tort? A tort is a wrongful injury to a person's person or a person's property. And there are three categories of torts. There's intentional torts, negligence, and strict liability. Now here's the difference. And intentional torts, what we're talking about here in this video. Intentional torts involve intentional wrongful injuries. There's an element of intent involved. But however, negligence, these are unintended wrongful acts. And that wrongful act is generally going to be failing to act as a reasonable person would act under the same circumstances. But these are unintended wrongful acts. And then we have strict liability, and that deals with abnormally dangerous activities and things. But what we're going to be talking about here will be intentional torts, intentional wrongful injuries. First of all, let's understand the difference between a tort and a crime, because a single act can constitute both a tort and a crime. But there are some differences that we need to look at. There's a difference in the goal of tort law and criminal law. The goal of tort law is to compensate the injured person, whereas the goal of criminal law is to punish the wrongdoer and perhaps provide a deterrent effect to others so that they do not do the same wrong. There's also a difference as to the burden of proof that's going to be required in the courtroom to establish either a tort versus a crime. A tort requires only a preponderance of the evidence, and what that means is that there has to be more evidence supporting or proving a tort than what there is evidence disproving the existence of that tortious injury. Now, with crime, however, I think we all know from TV shows and movies, it's beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher standard than a preponderance of the evidence. So with a reasonable doubt, beyond a reasonable doubt, what we're saying is no reasonable person would have a doubt as to the defendant's guilt. So it's a much higher, much more difficult standard to attain in a court case. The victim is also different in a tort versus a crime. In a tort, the victim is going to be some sort of a person, either a natural person like an individual, or perhaps even a artificial person like a corporation or some other business entity. Whereas with a crime victim, crimes and criminals victimize people and corporations, but that's not really the focus victim in with a crime, because all of society is the victim in a crime. And in fact, at least here in Texas, and I'm sure it's the same in other states where I'm not licensed, an indictment or a criminal complaint, always the last allegation is that these wrongful acts happened against the peace and dignity of the state. So we're saying with a crime, society is the victim, whereas with a tort, we have a person that is the victim of the tort. Then the two also differ with source of law. Common law is the primary source of law for tort law. Yes, there are some statutes in states that have been passed to clarify, limit, maybe even expand the common law, but tort law is overwhelmingly a matter of judge-made law, court decisions, what we call the common law, following a tradition of hundreds and hundreds of years. Whereas criminal law now in the United States is overwhelmingly going to be statutory law. Now, yes, there are some instances of some states still having some common law crimes, but many states have abolished their common law crimes and limit crime only to that which is statutory in nature. Now, all intentional torts protect an interest of some kind. And the second thing to understand on this board is that most intentional torts have a corresponding crime. So let's take a look at that. And I've prepared a large chart here. Here are our interests that are being protected by both torts and crimes. Now, we have a right to be free from threats of harm. And the tort that protects that would be called, in most places, and it differs from state to state, but in most places it would be called assault. And there's also a corresponding crime, and in many states, that threat of harm, as it's criminalized, might be called criminal assault. But we also have something very much related to a threat of harm. That would be the threat, just not a threat, but the actual harmful contact that might grow out of that threat of a harm. But that threat of that harmful contact in a tort would be called battery. In criminal law, it might also be called criminal assault, or in some places, assault and battery. So that's why I've put these two lines together, that depending on the state where you're at, it might have a different title to the crime. But the point is, these are the interests that are being protected by this private cause of action brought by a private citizen, private individual, or a person, called assault or battery, versus the crime, that criminal cause of action brought by the district attorney or a prosecutor of some sort, called assault and battery, or criminal assault in some places. We also have a tort of false imprisonment, and that protects the right to be free from restraint on our freedom. But then there's a corresponding crime to that. It may be called kidnapping in some states, or in other states there may be a lesser included offense called unlawful restraint. But the point is, this right or freedom over here, interest that we have, is protected both by a tort and both by a crime. Interference with possession of land, the tort would be called trespass. The crime, corresponding crime, might be called criminal trespass. Interference with personal property is an interest that is protected by tort law. We have two torts in many states, and once again, this will differ from state to state. It's called conversion or trespass to chattel. And the crime, the main crime that is associated with that, would be called theft. Then we have loss caused by false statements. Well, that's fraud, the tort of fraud, but that might also be the crime of embezzlement. Then we also have a right to have our good name and our reputation. That is protected by the tort of defamation, which has two subtorts, libel and slander. Libel for written defamation and slander for spoken defamation. Some states have criminalized that and some have not. So that's going to vary on the criminal side from state to state. Each tort will have its own unique set of elements, and I've got two torts up here. Battery. The elements of battery would be an act, and plus the intent to cause harmful or offensive contact, and then you actually do have that contact with the plaintiff, and then you have a causation element, a linkage between that act and that harmful contact. You take away any one of these or change it, you don't end up with battery. For example, if we take out harmful contact, you don't have battery. But if you put in its place apprehension of contact, well then all of a sudden you have the tort of assault. Let's take a look at abusive process. That's using civil or criminal proceedings in an improper purpose. And here you actually do have to have some damages. But these are the elements of abusive process. Take one of those elements away, change it, you don't have abusive process. You may or may not have another tort. Each tort has its own unique set of elements. And then there are defenses to all of these intentional torts that we're talking about. Each defense has its own unique set of elements that will distinguish it from other defenses. However, don't forget this, that the first line of a defense is going to be disproving the elements of the tort. If you can disprove the tort, then you don't need any other independent defense. Now, here are some examples of defenses. Consent. If someone consents to being punched in the nose, that's a defense to battery. If someone uses reasonable force to protect themselves from being punched in the nose, that's self-defense. Likewise, if they use reasonable force to protect someone else from being punched in the nose, that would be defense of others. You can also use reasonable force under some circumstances to protect your property. Then we have a number of privileges, and this is not an exhaustive list, but just by example here, a shopkeeper has a privilege to briefly detain a shopper to check to make sure that no shoplifting or theft is taking place. A police officer has a privilege to arrest someone with probable cause, as does a citizen. It's a little bit more shaky with a citizen, but if a citizen makes a valid citizen's arrest, which is probably not a good thing to do unless you absolutely have to, but that citizen would have a privilege for making that detaining and arrest, and that would protect them from a lawsuit. Parents have a privilege to exercise reasonable discipline over their children. So these are just some examples of privileges. And then we also have sovereign immunity. And this is the concept that the king can do no wrong, that government, you can't sue government without the government's permission. And of course, there's a whole body of law on that. That certain circumstances that applies and other circumstances sovereign immunity will not apply to. But yet it's still a defense to be considered under the right circumstances. And there are many other defenses that might apply in given cases beyond that. And so this is an overview of intentional tort.